He didn't come with swords or soldiers. He didn't ride a war horse or demand a throne. But when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the earth seemed to hold its breath. The streets shook, not with armies, but with palm branches and praises. And yet, behind every cheer, there was a shadow. Behind every hosanna, there was a whisper of fear, doubt, and betrayal. What seemed like a moment of victory was actually the beginning of a storm, and this storm would change everything. It began with the sound of feet, not the thunder of marching troops, but the steady rhythm of a crowd gathering, each step fueled by anticipation, awe, and a sense that something eternal was unfolding right in front of them. The road to Jerusalem was dusty, narrow, and lined with people holding palm branches, their eyes wide with hope. They had heard the stories, the blind who could now see, the dead who walked again, the fishermen turned messengers. And now, the man who had done all of it was approaching their holy city, not in secret, not in hiding, but in the open, riding on a donkey. It was prophecy in motion, and they knew it. But while the people shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," there was tension that no one could name but everyone could feel. Not far from the noise and praise, the religious leaders stood still, watching with narrowed eyes. Their faces were carved from stone, unmoved by the celebration. To them, this wasn't a Messiah entering the city. It was a challenge, a provocation, a direct confrontation with centuries of order, tradition, and power. And Jesus, he knew it. He didn't flinch, didn't smile for the crowd. His eyes were fixed straight ahead. He wasn't distracted by the cheers or the songs. He carried the weight of the moment like a man who knew exactly what it would cost. The disciples walked beside him, and even they weren't entirely sure how to feel. Peter's hand stayed close to his side, his eyes scanning the crowd for danger. Matthew watched everything like a man who was both amazed and deeply unsettled. Mary stayed close, her face filled with something deeper than joy, something closer to dread. They had followed Jesus through deserts, storms, and miracles. But this was different. This was a city that devoured prophets. This was Jerusalem. And inside the city, word traveled fast. The temple guards heard it first, their pace quickening as they moved to report to the priests. Roman soldiers overheard the chants from their posts and tightened their grips on their spears. Pilate was still in his fortress, sipping wine and trying to ignore the noise. But even he knew what a crowd could become if it believed too deeply. The city was a powder keg, and Jesus had just lit the fuse. Yet, nothing about his entry was rushed. Every step of the donkey felt deliberate, every moment stretched out like time itself was slowing down to witness it. Children ran ahead, laying down their cloaks. Old men wiped their eyes, whispering prayers they had long forgotten. Women held their infants high, hoping this man might bless their children with a glance. And through it all, Jesus remained silent, regal in his humility, powerful in his peace. His silence wasn't weakness. It was thunder waiting to speak. But not everyone in the crowd came to worship. Among the crowd were spies, paid eyes and ears of the Sanhedrin, slipping between the people, noting every move, every name, every shout of support. They didn't see a savior. They saw a threat to the temple, a rebel to the empire, a problem to be solved before Passover. And at the edge of the crowd, someone else stood watching, a man who had once believed with his whole heart, Judas. His face was unreadable, not angry, not joyful, just conflicted. The sight of Jesus being praised should have stirred something in him, but instead, it stirred doubt. The closer Jesus came to the city gates, the louder the crowd became. Shouts echoed off stone walls, palm branches waved like banners of war. But beneath it all, a question haunted every breath. What comes next? Because this man, this carpenter turned miracle worker, was not just entering a city. He was walking into destiny, into danger, into the final days of a mission the world had only just begun to understand. And as the gates of Jerusalem opened wide, it wasn't just the people welcoming a king, it was heaven and hell preparing for a battle that would shake the soul of every believer and doubter alike. The triumphant entry wasn't the end of a story, it was the beginning of a war. Not with swords, but with hearts. Not for land, but for eternity. As Jesus entered the heart of Jerusalem, the joy on the streets collided with the unease behind closed doors. While the people chanted his name in the open, in the shadows, a different kind of conversation was taking place. In the upper rooms of the temple, behind thick curtains and guarded hallways, the religious elite gathered. Their robes were spotless, their faces stern, but their hearts were burning, not with faith, but with fear. Caiaphas, the high priest, sat at the head of the table, his hands folded tightly, hiding the storm behind his calm eyes. What Jesus had done, this public display, this arrival, was more than just bold. It was dangerous. "This is not just another prophet," one whispered. "He's not coming to teach, he's coming to take." They could feel it. He was claiming something more than attention. He was claiming authority, and that was something they would never give. From the beginning, the Pharisees and Sadducees had watched Jesus closely. At first, they called him a rabbi, then a troublemaker, then a blasphemer. But now they saw him for what he really was, a man who could shift power. Not through rebellion, not with armies, but through belief. And that was the most terrifying weapon of all, because once people believe in something greater than the system starts to fall apart. Outside, the marketplace continued, but it pulsed differently now. Merchants still shouted, coins still changed hands, but there was a tension, like the air before a storm. Everyone had heard the name. Jesus. Some had seen the miracles, others had only heard rumors, but all of them knew that something was about to change. And in the middle of this swirling chaos, Jesus walked through the temple courts, quiet, observing, his footsteps echoing against the stone floor. It should have been a moment of peace, a teacher returning to his father's house. But instead, it was a moment heavy with judgment. His eyes moved across the stalls filled with sacrifices for sale, doves in cages, lambs tied with ropes, coins laid out like offerings to greed. This was supposed to be a house of prayer, a sanctuary, a place where God dwelled, but it looked more like a market, more like a prison for the soul. And still, Jesus said nothing. The disciples followed at a distance. They could sense his growing sorrow. His silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, loud, a silence that screamed in the hearts of those who truly listened. Peter walked with a clenched jaw. James kept looking over his shoulder, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Matthew wrote what he saw, his hand shaking slightly. Even they, after all their time with him, could feel that something was shifting. And somewhere in the crowd, Judas lingered, not beside the others, but slightly apart, always observing, always calculating. He watched the temple, not with reverence, but with frustration. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't the kind of kingdom he thought he had signed up for. Where were the banners of victory? Where were the Roman soldiers bowing? Where was the political shift that would place Jesus on a throne and Judas beside him in glory? All he saw was chaos, and in chaos, doubt grows like weeds. Back in the temple, Jesus continued to walk among the money changers, his face unreadable. The vendors barely noticed him. To them, he was just another traveler, just another face in the crowd. But he was watching and waiting, not out of hesitation, but purpose. Every second he spent in silence was a moment of grace, a warning, an invitation to turn back before the fire came. And still, the leaders plotted. News of his entrance spread faster than fire. Caiaphas paced now, not in panic, but in precision. He wasn't afraid of Jesus' power. He was afraid of the people's response to it. If they rose in his name, Rome would strike. Pilate would send in troops, and the fragile balance of power would crumble in a single day. And Pilate, he had heard the chants too. His advisors told him of the so-called prophet who entered the city to the sound of hosannas. He dismissed them with a wave at first, but the unease in the city couldn't be ignored. Crowds loved easily, and they turned even faster. He'd seen it before. One man could unite a crowd, but one whisper could shatter it. He ordered his guards to observe closely, not to act, not yet, but to watch. And what they saw was a man who refused to play by any rule, Roman or religious. As day faded into night, the city didn't calm. It trembled. Fires burned in the courtyards. Voices filled the air, some singing, some arguing. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had answers. Who was this man who rode a donkey like a king? Who walked the temple like a judge? Who held power, yet didn't use it to claim a throne? And somewhere, in the center of it all, Jesus prepared. Not for battle with swords, but for a battle of spirit, of truth, of sacrifice. As day faded into night, the city didn't calm. It trembled. Fires burned in the courtyards. Voices filled the air, some singing, some arguing. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had answers. Who was this man who rode a donkey like a king? Who walked the temple like a judge? Who held power, yet didn't use it to claim a throne? And somewhere, in the center of it all, Jesus prepared. Not for battle with swords, but for a battle of spirit, of truth, of sacrifice. The crowd thought the entry into Jerusalem was the climax, but Jesus knew it was only the beginning of betrayal, the beginning of suffering, the beginning of redemption. The city had seen many men enter its gates, kings, warriors, prophets, but none like him. Jesus didn't march in with soldiers or shout commands like a ruler. He came in stillness. But that silence was louder than any trumpet. It carried a weight, a gravity that made even the air around him feel thick with purpose. And while the crowds rejoiced, while they laid down palm branches and sang Hosanna, they didn't realize what they were welcoming. They thought it was a revolution of freedom. But Jesus came to break chains they couldn't even see. That night, Jerusalem could not sleep. The streets were alive with whispers, questions, and unease. People repeated the same words. Did you see him? Did you hear what he said? But no one could agree on who he really was. A prophet? A savior? A threat? In the quiet corners of homes, parents held their children a little closer. Elders prayed for peace. Merchants counted their silver nervously, wondering if the temple marketplace would survive what was coming. Meanwhile, the disciples gathered in silence. For once, even Peter had no words. They had followed Jesus through storms, through hunger, through miracles that defied reason. But now they stood on the edge of something else, something they couldn't explain. The triumph they had hoped for didn't feel like victory. It felt like a warning. Jesus wasn't celebrating. He wasn't smiling. His face was marked by something deeper, something that looked like grief. And Judas. Judas stood in the shadows of that room. He watched Jesus closely, more than anyone else, his eyes sharp, his heart restless. To Judas, this wasn't how things were supposed to happen. He had believed in the power of change. He had dreamed of a kingdom that would rise from the ashes of Roman rule. But what he saw now was a man who didn't care for power the way the world understood it. Jesus wasn't climbing toward a throne. He was walking toward a cross, and Judas couldn't accept that. The next morning, the temple stirred with new tension. Jesus returned, but not with celebration. He entered quietly, walking among the crowds like a stranger in his own city. But his silence was filled with resolve. The merchants were back, tables restocked, animals penned, money stacked high. It was as if nothing had changed, as if the King of Righteousness had never walked through. But Jesus remembered. He remembered every coin, every scam, every prayer drowned out by the sound of greed. And then it happened. Not in a flash of anger, but with a righteous fury. He picked up the cords, fashioned a whip, and stepped forward. The temple became a storm. Tables crashed to the floor, coins scattered like rain. Doves flew in panic. Lambs bleated, hooves scrambling over stone. People screamed. Some ran. Others stood frozen, watching the fury of a man who had come to cleanse, not to destroy, but the line between the two suddenly looked thin. He shouted, not to curse, but to correct. "You have turned my father's house into a den of thieves." Every word struck harder than the whip itself. It wasn't violence, it was judgment, a holy reckoning. And in that moment, the temple was no longer a place of tradition. It was a battlefield of truth. The priests watched in shock. The Pharisees whispered in fear. Even the Roman guards standing nearby didn't dare step in, because what they saw in Jesus' eyes was not madness, but authority. pure, unshakable, divine. But it wasn't just the crowd that was shaken. The disciples stood still, their hearts pounding. This wasn't the side of Jesus they were used to. He had always taught with kindness, healed with compassion. But now, he stood like a lion. And while some were filled with awe, others were filled with doubt. Was this the plan all along? Was this what he meant when he spoke of death and resurrection? The pieces were falling into place, but they were sharp, and they cut deep. And again, Judas watched, not with anger, not even with confusion, but with a quiet, growing resentment. He had risked everything to follow Jesus, his reputation, his future, his name. But what did he have to show for it? A scene of chaos. A Messiah who didn't play by any rule. A temple full of broken dreams. And in the silence that followed the cleansing, Judas turned away. Not just physically. In his heart, a door began to close. Not just physically. In his heart, a door began to close. And once closed, it would not open again. But Jesus, he didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply stood among the overturned tables, breathing slowly, looking at the people, not with hate, but with heartbreak. Because he knew what was coming. He knew this act would begin the end. And yet, he did not flinch. Because the truth needed to be told. The temple had to be reclaimed. The people had to see. Not the miracles, but the mission. And for that, he would be hated. For that, he would be hunted. As the sun dipped low, the city buzzed louder than ever. The temple was quiet now, but the rumors were loud. Every corner echoed with talk. Who is he? What will he do next? Will the Romans strike? Will the priests arrest him? And through it all, Jesus walked on, step by step, not as a man headed toward safety, but as a lamb walking toward sacrifice. As darkness fell over Jerusalem, a different kind of silence crept in, not peaceful, but heavy. It wrapped around the city like a warning, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The temple had returned to order, at least on the surface. Merchants picked up their coins, priests whispered behind closed doors, and the Pharisees plotted in hushed meetings. But beneath that fragile quiet, everything had changed. Jesus had drawn a line, and everyone who saw it was now forced to choose a side. In the corridors of power, Caiaphas was pacing, his hands clenched behind his back, his jaw tight. The temple had been humiliated. Their authority had been questioned in front of thousands. And worse, the people were still talking about it. Not with outrage, but with wonder. Who is this man who dares to confront the high priests? That question alone made him dangerous. The Sanhedrin didn't just want Jesus gone, they needed him silenced, quietly, strategically, without risking rebellion. They needed an insider, a weak link. And Judas. Judas was already drifting. He wasn't part of their plan yet, but his heart was moving in their direction, slowly, quietly. Betrayal doesn't come all at once. It starts with disappointment, then grows into bitterness. And Judas was already there. After everything, the miracles, the teachings, the hopes of a rising kingdom, what had it all led to? A temple turned upside down and a Messiah who refused to lead the way Judas expected. For Judas, this wasn't just disillusionment. It was heartbreak. And in that heartbreak, the seeds of betrayal were beginning to grow. But Jesus didn't chase him. He didn't explain himself to the angry, to the confused, or to the ones walking away. He moved forward. With every step, he was preparing. For what? No one fully understood. But there was a weight in his eyes. Not fear, not hesitation. Something deeper. Resolve. The kind that only comes when a man knows the end is near and still chooses to walk toward it. The disciples felt it too. The tension between them was rising. Peter was restless. He tried to speak up, tried to understand, but Jesus answered with silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because the truth couldn't be spoken yet. It had to be lived. Thomas, once full of questions, now stood quietly beside Matthew, watching Jesus closely. They could feel the air shifting around him, not just a leader anymore, not just a teacher, He was becoming something else, something they couldn't explain. In the streets, the crowd's love was growing, but so was their confusion. Some praised him as the Messiah, throwing cloaks in his path, hoping he'd overthrow Rome by sunrise. Others watched from shadows, fearful of what Rome would do in response. Even the Roman guards stationed at the gates were unsettled. Pilate had been warned. Whispers reached his palace about the man who had stirred the people, who had disrupted the temple, who now walked with power in his silence. And Pilate, ever cautious, began to ask questions of his own. Who is this Jesus of Nazareth? The next day, Jesus returned to the streets, but not with crowds and palm branches. This time he walked with purpose, but also with sorrow. He looked at Jerusalem, not with pride, but with pain. If only you had known what would bring you peace. His voice, though soft, echoed like thunder in the hearts of those nearby. Because peace wasn't coming through war, it wasn't coming through revolution, it was coming through surrender, through sacrifice. And no one wanted to hear that. Jesus continued to teach parables, stories, quiet truths, hidden in simple words. But the people began to shift. Some leaned in, others backed away. What they wanted was power. What he offered was something else entirely: truth, humility, surrender. And the more he spoke, the more he was misunderstood, even by those closest to him. And still, Judas watched. He walked with the others, ate with them, slept beside them. But his eyes were distant. His heart was elsewhere. And then came the whisper. A quiet voice in a dark corridor. A suggestion from the priests. "Help us. We only want to question him. You'll be rewarded. No one will know." And Judas didn't say yes? Not yet. But he didn't say no either. That's how betrayal begins. Not with a decision, but with silence. Meanwhile, Jesus prepared for the Passover, but his heart wasn't on the meal. It was on the cross. He spoke of bread and wine, of his body broken and blood poured out. The disciples listened, confused. This wasn't the victory dinner they imagined. It felt more like a goodbye. And though they didn't understand, Jesus kept speaking, because he knew. Soon they would remember. Soon they would need these words to survive what was coming. Night fell again, and in the quiet, the storm gathered. The priests met in secret. Roman officials doubled the guards. The disciples, unaware of how short time had become, slept under the same roof. But Jesus prayed, alone, in silence, in surrender. And Judas? He stood in the darkness, torn between loyalty and ambition, between what he thought he knew and what he could no longer believe. He looked at the silver coins, felt the weight of them in his hands, and in his heart, the door finally closed. The room was simple: a table, some bread, a cup of wine. The flicker of oil lamps cast soft shadows on the walls. But the silence that filled the space was louder than any crowd. This wasn't just a meal. It was the final gathering before everything would change. Jesus sat at the center, his face calm, but his eyes carrying the weight of what was coming. Around him were the men who had followed him through storms, through cities, through miracles, and yet none of them truly understood what this night meant. They were laughing at first, joking, passing bread, talking about the road behind and the road ahead. But then, Jesus broke the laughter with words that dropped like stones into still water. "One of you will betray me." The room froze. The air turned thick. No one moved. No one knew what to say. They looked at each other, confused, suspicious, afraid. Betrayal? Here? Among us? Peter, ever the bold one, leaned in. "Who is it, Lord?" "Surely not me." And one by one they began to ask the same, each voice more desperate than the last. But Judas said nothing at first. His hands trembled slightly, but his face remained still. And then Jesus locked eyes with him, just for a moment. No accusation, no anger, only sadness, and a quiet knowing. Judas swallowed hard. He had made his choice. Now it was only a matter of time. Jesus broke the bread, handed it out. "This is my body, broken for you." The disciples took it, still unsure. Then he raised the cup. "This is my blood, poured out for many." A sacred ritual, but filled with grief. None of them could explain the feeling in their chest. It was as if something was ending, though they didn't yet know what. Then Jesus stood. He looked around the table, at Peter's fierce loyalty, Matthew's quiet observation, Thomas's searching eyes, and John's open heart. These were his brothers, his students, his friends. And yet, he knew they would all fall away. Not out of hatred, but fear. When the hour came, they would run. Still, he loved them. He chose them, even knowing what they would do. Judas rose quietly and slipped out the door. The others barely noticed. But Jesus did. And though he didn't stop him, his heart broke with every step Judas took toward the dark. The meal ended with a hymn, voices trembling, unsure, and then Jesus led them out into the night. They walked through narrow streets, past quiet homes, toward the Mount of Olives. The city slept, unaware of what history was unfolding beneath the moonlight. Jesus spoke as they walked, words that felt like riddles, warnings about trials, promises of a helper, hints of betrayal, denial, and sorrow. The disciples listened, but confusion filled their hearts. When they reached the garden, Jesus told them to wait. "Pray so you don't fall into temptation." Then he walked a little farther, alone, and there in the stillness of Gethsemane, the weight of the world pressed down. He fell to his knees, not because he was weak, but because the burden was so great. The cross wasn't just wood and nails. It was sin, shame, betrayal, and death. And Jesus felt it all, the loneliness, the fear, the cost. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." His voice cracked under the pressure. Sweat mixed with blood dripped from his forehead. But still, he chose surrender. "Not my will, but yours be done." 3 times he prayed. 3 times he returned to find the disciples sleeping. Even Peter, who had sworn to never leave his side, couldn't keep his eyes open. And still, Jesus loved them, even now. Then came the sound of footsteps. Not the gentle shuffle of friends, but the steady march of soldiers. Torches lit the night, metal clinked in the dark, and leading them was Judas. He stepped forward, his face pale, his eyes cold. No words were needed. He greeted Jesus with a kiss. Jesus didn't flinch. He looked into Judas's eyes and said the words that echo through history. "Do what you came to do." The guards moved fast. They grabbed Jesus, bound his hands. Peter lunged forward, sword in hand, striking the servant of the high priest. But Jesus stopped him. "Put your sword away." This wasn't a battle won by force. It was a sacrifice made by choice. And just like that, the disciples scattered. Fear overcame loyalty. Confusion drowned courage. Jesus was led away into the darkness. He had come in with celebration, palm branches, songs, hope. Now he was leaving with chains. The road to the cross had begun. And yet, he walked it willingly. The night was still, but inside the walls of Jerusalem, everything was in motion. Jesus had been captured, and the city's most powerful men were already awake, waiting for this moment. The Sanhedrin, the ruling council of priests, elders, and scribes, had what they wanted. But this wasn't justice. It was strategy, control, a carefully designed trap set in motion long before the garden, long before the kiss. Jesus stood before them, silent and bruised. His hands were tied, but his spirit remained free. Caiaphas, the high priest, paced like a predator, his voice rising with every question. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Others hurled insults. They twisted his words, brought in false witnesses, tried to make him stumble. But Jesus didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. He was not there to win a case. He was there to fulfill a mission. But the silence didn't last forever. When Caiaphas demanded again, "Tell us plainly, are you the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus answered, and his words cut through the room like thunder. "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven." The room exploded. Caiaphas tore his robes, his voice trembling with rage. "Blasphemy!" he shouted. And just like that, The decision was made. They didn't need more evidence. They didn't need Rome's permission. In their eyes, he was already guilty. But execution under Jewish law wasn't simple. They needed Pilate. And they knew the Roman governor wouldn't care about blasphemy. So, they rewrote the charges. He claims to be king. That was treason. That was a threat Rome would not ignore. While Jesus was dragged through hallways and courtyards, Peter was nearby, close enough to see but far enough to hide. He had promised to follow Jesus to the end, but now fear was louder than love. A servant girl recognized him. "You were with him," she said. Peter shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." Another voice, another accusation. Again, he denied it. And then, a third time. "I swear, I don't know the man." At that moment, a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered. Jesus had warned him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." The sound crushed him. He looked up and saw Jesus in the distance. Their eyes met, no anger, only sorrow. Peter ran. The strongest among the disciples was broken. Guilt chased him into the shadows. By morning, Jesus was standing before Pilate. Pontius Pilate, Rome's voice in Jerusalem, was not a man who cared for religion. He ruled with cruelty and caution. The Jewish leaders stood before him, pushing their charges, pressing their fear. "He stirs up the people," they claimed. "He claims to be a king." Pilate looked Jesus over. He expected rebellion, he expected violence, but what he saw was a man calm in the face of death. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. "You say that I am," Jesus replied. Pilate was puzzled. This wasn't the rebel he expected. He saw no threat, no anger, only truth. He turned back to the priests. "I find no fault in this man." But they shouted louder. They demanded action. They stirred up the crowd. The same people who had cheered Hosanna now shouted, "Crucify him." Pilate sent Jesus to Herod. Herod mocked him, dressed him in a royal robe, laughed in his face, and sent him back. No one wanted to deal with him, but the pressure was building. The crowd was boiling over. The priests had done their work well. Pilate tried one more time. "I'll release one prisoner to you, Jesus or Barabbas." Barabbas was a known rebel, a man of violence, but the crowd, stirred by fear and manipulation, chose him. "Give us Barabbas," they cried. "And what should I do with Jesus?" Pilate asked. "Crucify him," they screamed. Pilate hesitated. His wife had sent word, "Have nothing to do with this righteous man. I had a dream about him." But Pilate saw the crowd. He saw the risk, and he chose to wash his hands. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. But his words didn't wash away the truth. Jesus was handed over. The soldiers took him, beat him, mocked him. They placed a crown of thorns on his head, a robe on his shoulders, and bowed before him in cruel mockery. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they sneered. And through it all, Jesus remained steady, silent, strong. He carried no weapons. He spoke no threats. He bore the weight of the world, and he did not look away. The sky was still dark when they led him away. Jesus, beaten and bloodied, carried the weight of the cross through the streets of Jerusalem. Every step was heavy, every breath a struggle. The same streets that once echoed with Hosanna were now filled with silence and horror. The people who had laid palm branches beneath his feet now stood back, watching the Son of Man stumble. He didn't resist. He didn't curse. He walked with quiet strength, every movement filled with purpose. This was not a fall from grace. This was the fulfillment of it. The road to Calvary was lined with faces, some weeping, some sneering, some just watching, not knowing what to feel. Among them was Mary, his mother, her heart crushed under the weight of seeing her son suffer. She didn't scream. She didn't protest. But her silence was louder than any cry. John walked beside her, eyes wide with grief. And behind them, the disciples, scattered, broken, confused. Only a few remained close. The others had vanished, hiding in fear and disbelief. When Jesus reached the hill called Golgotha, the soldiers forced him down. The sound of the hammer rang through the air. Once, twice, again. Nails through his hands, nails through his feet. The cross was raised, and with it, so was the hope of the world. People had expected a throne, a sword, a king who would overthrow Rome. But now their king hung on wood surrounded by criminals. The crowd mocked him. "If you're the Son of God, save yourself." But he stayed. Above his head, a sign read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The irony was sharp, but the truth was deeper than anyone realized. He was the king, not of armies, but of hearts, not of kingdoms made by men, but of the eternal. As the hours passed, darkness covered the land, not just in the sky, but in the hearts of those watching. One thief cursed him, but the other turned and whispered, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus, even in agony, responded with compassion, "Today you will be with me in paradise." No anger, no blame, only grace. Below the cross, the soldiers cast lots for his clothing. Nearby, the religious leaders stood with folded arms. They believed they had won. They believed the threat was over. But they didn't know that the story was just beginning. What looked like defeat was actually the deepest act of love the world had ever seen. Jesus cried out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Even now, his words were full of mercy. Even now, he thought not of his pain, but of their souls. Then he looked to heaven and spoke again, this time to his Father, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." And with one final breath, he gave everything. The earth shook. The temple veil tore in two. The sky turned black. Nature itself seemed to cry out. The soldiers who had mocked him now looked at the cross with fear. "Surely this was the Son of God," one whispered. In that moment, everything changed. Not just for Jerusalem, but for the world. Back in the city, the Sanhedrin felt relief. But deep down, fear still flickered. Pilate sat in silence, troubled by what he'd allowed. The disciples scattered, unsure of what to believe anymore. Judas, alone, ashamed, and consumed by guilt, sank deeper into despair. He had made his choice, but he could not live with its weight. The body of Jesus was taken down, gently wrapped in linen by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Two men who had once stood in secret now stepped forward in courage. Mary watched as they laid her son in a tomb. A heavy stone was rolled into place. And then, silence. But in that silence, something powerful was growing. The world thought the story was over. The priests believed they had crushed the rebellion. The Romans thought they had ended the threat. But heaven knew better. The tomb was not the end. It was the beginning of everything. And as the city settled into uneasy sleep and the guards stood watch at the sealed tomb, the heavens waited. The earth waited. Because in just a few days, everything would change again. The stone would roll. The grave would open. And the man they crucified would walk again. He wasn't just a teacher. He wasn't just a prophet. He was and is the Son of God. And his journey was far from over. Sometimes, the most powerful stories are not the ones with happy endings, but the ones that break us open, only to fill us with something greater. As we walk through episode 2 of The Chosen Season 5, we're not just witnessing events from the past. We're being invited into a living story, one that still moves hearts, one that still asks us the hardest questions. Because this isn't just a show. This is a mirror. We saw Jesus walk into Jerusalem to cheers and palm branches, but we also saw him walk out to carry a cross. We saw the disciples full of dreams and then full of doubt. We saw Judas not as a villain, but as a man torn apart by expectations unmet. And in all of it, we saw ourselves, our fear, our confusion, our betrayal, and yet, our hope. Jesus didn't just enter a city. He entered the very center of every human heart, bringing light into our darkest corners. He didn't flip tables just to cleanse the temple. He flipped the world's idea of power, of faith, of love. The whip in his hand wasn't violence. It was a warning, a call to return to what's real, what's holy. And when he stood silent before his accusers, it wasn't weakness. It was strength in its purest form. In this episode, we've journeyed through tension, fire, heartbreak, and silence. And now we sit in the quiet that follows the storm, the kind of quiet that asks you, what now? For the disciples, it meant questions without answers. For Mary, it meant holding a promise that looked shattered. For the world, it meant facing the truth that the Messiah didn't come to conquer men. He came to conquer death. And love doesn't always look like what we want. Sometimes love looks like loss. Sometimes love looks like silence. Sometimes love hangs on a cross. But this is not the end. This is the breath before resurrection. This is the last night before the dawn breaks. So if you're watching and you feel shaken, confused, or even heartbroken, that's okay. You're not alone. Because the chosen isn't just telling his story. It's telling ours too. The story of how we fall, how we fail, and how grace still finds us in the middle of our worst moment. And that's what makes episode 2 so powerful. It doesn't just show us Jesus the King. It shows us Jesus the Lamb, the one who gave everything, the one who stepped into the fire so we could walk out of it whole. So as you wait for the next episode, don't just wait for more scenes. Wait with a heart open to transformation. Let the story do what it's meant to do, not just entertain you, but awaken something inside you, something ancient, something eternal. Because the journey isn't over. It's only just beginning. And soon, that stone will roll, and everything will change.